Round about the time of World War II, Romania was invaded first by the Nazis and then by the Russians who were there to fight the Nazis. The communists, when they took over, brought their atheism with them. I have in my collection both the book and the movie entitled Tortured for Christ. The book written by a pastor Richard Warrenbrand, um, and the movie allegedly based on the life of Pastor Richard Warrenbrand. The same group that did this also recently did a movie supposedly about his wife called Sabina, Tortured for Christ, the Nazi Years. Um, the movie does a little bit about going into what Richard noticed about um, how the church, the established, registered, approved of churches, were being used by the communists to sort of uh, throw wide the gates, really, to not only uh, let the wolves in with the sheep, but also to hand over the shepherding duties to the sheep. The book by Richard Wurmbrand actually goes into much greater detail on this point. Um, and we're coming up at Richard's son, Michael Wurmbrand, spoke out on Voice of the Martyrs organization because of what they have been doing in his father's name. Voice of the Martyrs took over control, the publishing rights or whatever, of the Tortured for Christ movie, at least, and I think maybe the book. Um, and it certainly had a lot to do with the movie that reportedly gave the account of Sabina, of Michael's mother. Michael has been fighting to expose the horrific things that Voice of the Martyrs has actually done. One, for instance, is they claim that the money donated to them, to their organization, goes to providing or smuggling. They make it sound like that a lot of the money donated to them goes into smuggling Bibles into places like China. There are all kinds of scandals and everything else surrounding Voice of the Martyrs. But the China Bible thing is actually much more sinister than that, because the Bibles are printed in China by Chinese people and then distributed through Voice of the Martyrs at a high profit back to the same Chinese people that just printed them in China. That is but one of many egregious things that Michael Wurmbrand spoke out on concerning trying to refocus the message on how the organized registered church was about to be used. And he saw this all over the world. He saw this firsthand as a boy in Romania. But in his work in the intervening years, again, speaking against communism and other threats to the people of Christ that are rooted in and being sort of camouflaged by registered churches, he did a lot of work. I'm talking about in past tense. I've written letters back and forth with Michael. I don't know if he's still alive. He was quite old. couple years ago when I was writing back and forth to him. I should probably write him again. But his work was trying to alert the redeemed of the Lord that what he had seen in Romania was largely already in place here in the West, and yes, even in America. That the church had already been militarized, weaponized, and basically already conditioned as an agent of the state for what is coming to all of us. Now, I have tried to bring Michael and his knowledge before I guess self-appointed or board-appointed leaders, capital P pastors in various churches. And I've been told that my crusade was not shared by the congregation in question. I've been trying, as many people have, been trying to proclaim the freedom of Christ to the people of Christ so that they know they truly are free. Free even from those things which claim but only pretend to be representative or sanctioned by Jesus Christ. And what we have in this process, the step we are in now, over these last few years, the church has been where Peter was not too long ago in the passage that we were reading. I will never betray you. I would die before I'd let anything hurt you. To what we just read, that is overreaction, taking lethal action against the priest's servant, not even like the guard or whatever that was there. Misdirected violence and aggression to try to forestall something that he had just been told was absolutely necessary and part of God's will. That is where many people who believe themselves to be of the fold are right now. Let's continue following Peter and see how this will progress. Then the company of soldiers, the commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they led him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one. Here's what is so important about the book of John. John constantly either foreshadows or back references pertinent aspects of the narrative he's telling. He's always updating you on a frame of reference so you do not forget. This is why reading larger passages of scripture is utterly important. You lose context if you don't. In this series, we have read what John is mentioning here, because it wasn't that long ago, really. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it would be better for one man to die for the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. Pay attention to how this works out. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest. So he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, the other disciple. But Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was a doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" "I am not," he said. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. Put a mental pin here because John does, and he returns to what he had been talking about before Peter's first denial. He continues that story. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. "I've spoken openly to the world," Jesus answered him. "I've always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all the Jews congregate, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said." The same synagogues that Jesus is telling his true disciples they were going to be thrown out of is where Jesus did all of his teaching. Not all of his teaching, but a lot of his teaching. When he had said these things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" Idolatry of a person. "If I've spoken wrongly," Jesus answered him, "give evidence about the wrong. Prove it. But show what I did wrong. But if rightly, why do you hit me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So Jesus wasn't even in front of the high priest at the time. Let's pay attention to this. Jesus was in front of Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest. He was not yet in front of the high priest. And somebody slapped Jesus and said, "Is this how you talk to the high priest?" Okay, the level of deception by degrees is very familiar to many of us by now. And Jesus said, even knowing that he could have just been like, "That's not the high priest," said, "If I've spoken wrongly," going now to the validity and the verity of his words, "give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why do you hit me?" Not even acknowledging the deceit on the part of the person who slapped him. Then Annas, the person that's not the high priest, sent him bound. Jesus was tied up when this happened, to Caiaphas, the actual high priest. Now back to Peter. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it and said, "I'm not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter denied it again. Immediately a rooster crowed. Back to Jesus. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They did not enter the headquarters themselves, Gentile dwelling place, otherwise they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" Truth be told, Pilate could have had all of the priests killed for disrupting the peace outside of his residence. But because the word of God is inviolate, it was allowed to play out this way. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you." Pilate told them, You take him and judge him according to your law." "It's not legal for us to put anyone to death," the Jews declared. "We want him dead, but we can't do it. We don't have any reason to want him dead. We just want him dead, and we want you to do it for us." They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, indicating what kind of death he was going to die. Then Pilate went back to the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" I'm not a Jew, am I? Pilate replied. Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? My kingdom is not of this world, said Jesus. Let me repeat that. For reasons. My kingdom is not of this world, said Jesus. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom is not from here. You are a king, then, Pilate asked. You say that I'm a king, Jesus replied. I was born for this, and I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who was of the truth listens to my voice. What is truth? Said Pilate. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no grounds for charging him. You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? They shouted back, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Here is the man. When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, Crucify! Crucify! Pilate responded, Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him. We have a law, the Jews replied to him, and according to that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God, answering a question nobody asked. When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release? Let's pay attention to this one too. So Pilate said to him, Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? You would have no authority over me at all, Jesus answered him, if it hadn't been given to you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him. But the Jews shouted, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, Here is your king. They shouted, Take him away, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. We are at time for a pause in this series. Another break. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. I want some coffee. It's getting late. But I want that to hang heavy in the ears of those who are afraid to cling to God's demonstrated faithfulness to his word, his character, and his promises for the sake of tradition, keeping an appearance of the law, maintaining the status quo, and their own sense of power. See you in the next one.